do you think some of these fundamentals are being used? And if they are, how or in what sectors, for example? Because again, for me, whenever I think about Islamic finance, for some reason, I get a picture of a bank in my mind. For some reason, I don't know why, but...
No, very being used. Again, to give you another example, arbitration, right? Which is pretty much today, whatever sector you operate in, whatever contract you sign, if it's a business contract, more often than not, if there's a dispute and you need to resolve it, you go through an arbitration system, right? If you go like a long way back, arbitration systems typically you go to a single arbitrator who's like an important person, a knowledgeable person, and he basically decides between the two people who have a disagreement. The Quran came and said, no, you can have another system where it becomes effectively...
Thank you for listening to the podcast thus far. The one favor I would ask, if you're enjoying what you're listening to, is to press the follow and subscribe button on whatever media platform you listen to us, as it helps us grow our network and grow the podcast. So thank you and enjoy the podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to Alchemy Uncensored podcast. We're on our third season, and we promise you that we'll bring you more valuable insights into the financial and tax sectors of the UAE. Today, we've got a very special guest, Youssef Salem. He's one of the youngest CFOs to ever grace both Nasdaq and ADX. Youssef currently serves as a CFO of ADNOC Drilling. His career includes roles as the former CFO of AIQ, MENA's fastest unicorn and first AI unicorn, and Swivel, first MENA's unicorn to list on Nasdaq. As executive director at Moelis, he spearheaded transactions exceeding $100 billion. Beyond his corporate accomplishments, Youssef is the visionary founder of Qura 71, Hub 71's premier angel investor syndicate. For today's episode, we are going to speak about a very interesting topic, and I'm excited to speak about it in detail with Youssef. And with that, we're just going to kickstart the episode. So, Youssef, thanks a lot for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's an incredible program, so super privileged to be on it.
I'm so excited because of the topic today, which we're going to dive into, about Islamic finance, which I think is a very interesting topic that you've been posting about recently all over like social media, especially LinkedIn and stuff, which kind of sparked that interest in me to say, well, this is quite an interesting topic. I don't know much about it. Why don't I, reach out and we do a podcast about it as well. But before we get into really like what that is, etc., right before we started this podcast, you and I were just talking about kind of like branding and, LinkedIn and content, etc. And, I'd like to start there just because I think that, a lot of the content that you've been putting out professionally, on the personal side, on, whether it's work related or your different ventures on the side is quite an interesting thing because there's a lot of it that's happening, right? And you were telling me, what started, this whole content creation for you. Like, what was the reason that you started posting a lot, let's say, or social media interaction and content?
I started spamming a bit.
Yeah. You were like all over my LinkedIn at some point, like all over. I'm like, this guy, and I was like, okay, you know what? We're doing a podcast because you're going to say yes and we're going to sit down and do this.
Good. So the spamming worked. I got to be here, so it works.
Exactly.
So I think a few things. I think one is I've been privileged now that kind of my last three roles have all been public listed companies. So kind of Swivel listed on Nasdaq, and then AIQ, which got merged into Precite, listed on the Abu Dhabi exchange, and then ADNOC Drilling on the Abu Dhabi exchange. And hence, obviously, retail investors on the exchange for us a very critical constituent of our overall stakeholder base. And being able to engage with these retail investors happens most effectively via socials, via video, via content, etc. Plus, even for institutional investors, yes, we obviously meet them more formally in conferences and non-deal roadshows, etc. But even all of these investors, we do have them on LinkedIn, etc. And it's a way to kind of stay more alive, more personal, and keep this kind of relationship going. Second is, as you said, I think that whole kind of corporate and personal branding, that's all converging, right? Because at the end of the day, humans engage with humans, right? So at the end of the day, yes, you have the corporate communication, you have the corporate brand, the corporate narrative, but at the end, people are really engaging with the people behind this narrative, as opposed to with the kind of the corporate itself on its own. And hence, humanizing this a bit more and kind of being able to be a bit more engaging also helps a lot from that perspective.
Yeah. Like, do you find that a lot of people, for example, having read your content, would easily come up to you and maybe like start a conversation with you or something like that, just because it's more human?
100%. Like the number of like just cold messages on like LinkedIn you get like after the, especially LinkedIn, because that's the one I use kind of most extensively. It's just people reach out, and that's phenomenal, right? Because then the connections you make and that ability, and I think once people kind of figure out this is all kind of approachable, accessible, open, and we can kind of have discussions about so many different things, the valuable connectivity you get from there is really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, even for us as a business, I mean, I would say that we are probably one of the most out there recruitment agencies or recruitment companies in the UAE, you know, with our content, with our podcast, and just trying to add value and do something different.
It's clear. And that's why you're so successful. Partially why you're so successful.
Yeah,
among other reasons, but partially.
I think it's a very big reason, because just now I was saying to you that, you know, this is the way that a business is going to survive the next 10, 20 years. Because, you know, if you don't have that branding and content, then it won't. And, you know, personal brand has become also a very huge topic, right? And I think that there's the right ways of doing it and there's the wrong ways of doing it. And I think that, you know, with what you've done, it's an example of a right way of doing it, you know, kind of sharing information, adding value, and knowing what kind of information and value that you are providing to the network or to the audience or whatever it is. So I think it's quite interesting because, yeah, not a lot of people do it. And I would encourage people to do it more, but, you know, you need to be a subject matter expert to kind of, you know, be in that position to share that information. And yeah, tell us a little bit about the content you've been sharing, because you've been sharing different kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and by the way, on that also subject matter expert point, right? Like, for example, come to the content in a second, but I started writing this content about like Islamic finance and kind of the financial rules in Quran, etc. But then some of these posts ended up being contributions from people who would just reach out either in the comments or in messages and say, hey, by the way, that's a post on this topic, and I kind of post as a contribution from them. So yes, it's important to be knowledgeable, but I think there's also a lot about stimulating kind of sharing. So even if you're not a subject matter expert on something, but you set up the right platform and invite people to contribute and bring subject matter experts, there's value add in this collaboration in the first place.
Starting a conversation.
Exactly. Because that's all what it is, right? It is a conversation, and everyone has an insight, has a value add. It's only once the conversation becomes free flowing, like the one we're having, only then you kind of really becomes valuable.
Yeah, no, I completely agreed. But yeah, like, so the type of content I've seen you do, you know, you've done a lot of things on the ADNOC side, you've done a lot of things with the Hub 71, I think, and obviously this Islamic finance as well, which is what we're going to dive into today a little bit more. And in all honesty, I'm sitting here, I don't really know much. I know I told you that before, like I don't really know much. I think I should know more than I actually do, but hopefully by the end of this, I'll be able to, you know, define it a little bit better, or maybe know a couple of things a little bit better. So with that, then let's just, you know, jump right in with, I don't want to say like, what is the definition, but what is actually Islamic finance? What does that mean?
You're absolutely right. Most people don't. And this is because we have this sometimes misconception that, look, we've kind of got modern finance or modern science in general, which is all English, is all modern, is all coming from kind of different parts of the world. And then we've got kind of religion, which is kind of older. It's from like 1400 years ago. It's in Arabic. It's kind of, and it's more of a kind of a religious book and religious texts, right? But the reality is not at all. The reality is, if you go back to these religious texts and you go back to beyond even like Islam specifically, or a specific kind of our specific holy book, but if you go generally to anyone's culture, traditions, etc., you'll find so many things that are so many relevant and kind of transcend time and place in ways that you'll be able to get so much value from that, right? So the example we kind of use to kind of almost stimulate this wider conversation is Islamic finance, or is, let's say, financial rules in the Holy Book of Quran, right? And once you drill in, you find extremely valuable lessons. And this is not like high level. This is like very specific things. Like, to give you some examples, financial tools, right? For example, in Quran, you have effectively the zakat system, which basically is 2.5% on wealth, right? So if you have like unutilized wealth for like a year, so that's, you can think of it like a negative interest rate that the government is charging on money sitting there in order to basically kind of encourage people to spend and invest more to stimulate the economy, as opposed to compound wealth. You do have kind of in hadith, in the Prophet's sayings, a system around advanced collection of taxes. If effectively the government is at a time where there's a financial challenges, we can potentially advance collect from people. You basically have the kind of the way the tax system is set up in Islam with deductible levels. So below a certain level, you don't pay taxes if your income, so that you kind of reduce the burden on people. So you have these very actionable tools that governments can actually use to be able to drive outcomes and economic outcomes, not just kind of high level principles and ideas.
Yeah. If we and this is not on the script, sorry, by the way, I'm just going to ask
go,
you.
go for whatever you want.
So if we really drill down on, around, for example, why maybe finance in someone's mind is a little bit more, and this is specifically speaking about from an Islamic standpoint, why it's a little bit more Western. Do you think there's a language barrier? I would think that for me, for example, business Arabic is really difficult, right? I really need to sit there and I've done it a couple of times, and most recently done an entire meeting, a full hour in Arabic. You know how that can be difficult, especially if you come from a Western education. Do you think that contributed to kind of the separation? Maybe, I don't know.
Definitely. I think that's part of it. I think there's a part around stigma as well. Is people thinking, okay, am I really gonna find there something that's relevant for today's world? And sometimes in our kind of quest to be too modern and too open, we kind of worry a little bit about kind of referring to more traditional or religious texts. But if you think about it, the whole European Renaissance was driven by the translation of Arabic and other texts, right? So at the end of the day, you don't need to even consume it only in its native language. It's more about drilling into, translating, and building on it. And again, if you look at the concepts, they far transcend a specific language. You look at, for example, a lot of the concepts in Islamic finance is about financial economics. For example, is about how do you build a sustainable capitalistic business, right? So a lot of times the debate in Islamic finance is, what's the Islamic finance system? Is it a more socialist system? Is it a more capitalist system? And the reality is it's a really balanced, sustainable capitalism model that basically says you have to have free markets, so kind of free pricing, free demand, free supply in the marketplace, but then you have to couple that with a redistribution system in terms of taxation, with kind of governance and regulations to protect kind of the less privileged people, and you effectively have to couple it with the right rules in place to govern all of that. So it's kind of that very balanced system. It talks about how you need to have this kind of generational wealth, right? So almost like the prelude to the sovereign wealth funds as we know them today, to maintain that kind of generation. It talks about how resources can potentially be a blessing or a curse. So the whole kind of Dutch disease and the whole resource curse we then came to know later on. So a lot of these ideas which really kind of transcend language, which can be translated and then kind of used globally.
Yeah. It sounds really deep, by the way, because the thing is, whenever we were talking about this before, I remember saying to you, for me, it's interest rates. That's what I know. And I don't know why that's what I know rather than everything else. Why is it that this is the first thing that...
Yeah, I think unfortunately, again, because we kind of tend to focus a lot on the things which are potentially us versus them, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what's permissible, what's impermissible. So kind of the whole idea of interest rates and riba, which is obviously extremely critical, but it's not the kind of the end of it, and it's all. And people tend to kind of focus on this, is it allowed, it's not allowed. But if you look at some of the things, it's not about what's allowed. For example, you take behavioral finance and Islamic finance, right? So the Quran talks about kind of the idea of kind of overconfidence, right? About the idea of overcorrection. When you kind of go in one direction, then you overcorrect to the other direction. Talks about loss aversion, right? Effectively of the fear of kind of missing out or the fear of losing, etc. So it talks about biases, even when it comes to, I think about hiring, right? You're a recruiter, you have a couple of verses in the Quran which describe the kind of the coupling of technical competence and effectively trust or kind of personal traits and how they come together. So both. I
need that exact one. Actually.
Yes. So kind of both when describing Prophet Joseph, and then when talking about Prophet Moses, in both cases, the exact description of them was on one hand referring to their strength, which is kind of you can take for their competence, for their technicalities, and then on the other hand referring for their trust, for their kind of for trustworthiness. And it's interesting that they almost was alternative order. So in one it was this, and then the other other way around was the other way around. So it's almost that balanced importance of the two going together hand in hand. So it's really relevant concepts.
Yeah. If we were to just say, off the top of your head, I know you gave a lot of examples there, but if we talk about fundamentals, right? Let's talk about the top, I don't know, 2 or 3 fundamentals. And if you could explain that to me, what that is, for anyone that maybe, because I think this podcast, is going to be relevant for a lot of people that I think are Muslims to start with, Arabs, as well. And just generally speaking, Western communities that maybe are curious, I guess, and maybe living in the Middle East and curious about what this really is. So if you could just say, 2 or 3 fundamentals at the top of your mind that, they'd be like, oh, this is quite interesting, and I know of this fundamental, let's say, from somewhere else maybe.
So, for example, first one is financial systems, right? So we've seen the whole kind of FTX saga when FTX was going down, and the fundamental problem with FTX was there was no segregation. So client money was being used on the exchange to fund trading activities, and at the end there was no money for the clients and the business went under. In Quran, it's very clear that there has to be full segregation of client or beneficiary funds from any principal funds, and there can't be any comminglement of both, right? And it's kind of black and white. Second, for example, if you take contracts provisions, in Islam it sets very clearly what does a contract structure look like. So one, verbal contracts are enforceable, which they are under the majority of the legal systems today. However, there is a strong preference and recommendation for written law to avoid ambiguity. There is, for example, you cannot unilaterally terminate a contract without the other person consent. There has to be a protection that people have to understand the contract. If you sign a contract without understanding it, it's not enforceable. And if you can't understand it, you have to seek legal advice for the contract to become enforceable. The contract cannot have a law violation. So if you and me agree a clause, but that clause is illegal under the laws of the governing law governing the contract, then that clause is impermissible and unenforceable despite being in the contract. So it's that level of specificity, which now we're very comfortable with and we know it very well from systems, but mostly systems that came into fruition in the last 100 to 100 years, whereas all of these rules were black and white from 1,400 years ago.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting, actually. Because, yeah, you're right, like reading contracts and all that kind of stuff, like there are basics of like 1, 2, 3, like how it should be put together. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and I think a lot of people that would be listening to this as well would think about that and think about, that they know these fundamentals probably from somewhere else or whatever it is. So in the business world, do you think some of these fundamentals are being used? And if they are, how or in what sectors, for example? Because again, for me, whenever I think about Islamic finance, for some reason, I get a picture of a bank in my mind. For some reason, I don't know why, but...
No, very being used. Again, to give you another example, arbitration, right? Which is pretty much today, whatever sector you operate in, whatever contract you sign, if it's a business contract, more often than not, if there's a dispute and you need to resolve it, you go through an arbitration system, right? If you go like a long way back, arbitration systems typically you go to a single arbitrator who's like an important person, a knowledgeable person, and he basically decides between the two people who have a disagreement. The Quran came and said, no, you can have another system where it becomes effectively a party-nominated arbitration. So you and I have a disagreement, you bring one person, I bring one person, and then the two people between them decide, and then the two people, they can decide to bring a third independent person. But it allows each one of them, us to provide their perspective and to have that more balanced system. And today, if you look at the vast majority, if not all the arbitration systems globally, which are the large one, they rely on this party-nominated arbitration system. So it's kind of very much alive today.
Like, do you think it's because to remove emotion from decision making, or what's the purpose behind that?
Exactly, and to provide balance, right? Because at the end of the day, different perspectives. So if we go maybe to one person, that person may not necessarily be able to understand all our perspectives. But if I bring a person who I would probably bring from my side of the world, my understanding of what things are, you do the same. Now, if they need to bring a third person for independence, they can do that. But the people are much more knowledgeable about the specific topic, as opposed to, let's say, a single judge or a single person who's looking at so many different topics that have nothing to do with each other, and he or she cannot be an expert in every one of them.
Yeah. That's very interesting, to be fair. So, I think an emotion part of it, and also how you can connect with someone and tell them exactly how things are. And maybe they can bring it to that table to kind of come to an agreement, let's say, from that side. But like, what... some people might say to you that in the finance world, especially now, like, with everything that's going on, AI, technology, blah, 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 they think about, and again, this is not on the script. They think about like finance and timelines moving forward. So what would you say to people that, because you're effectively saying we can look backwards and maybe that can tell us exactly what's going on now and kind of guide us into the future. What would you say to people that would tell you, well, no, it needs to be something that keeps changing into the future, becoming more modern rather than looking back? Like, what would you say to someone like that?
But I think when you're looking back, what are you looking for? One, you're looking for inspirations. You're not looking for something to just kind of copy paste.
Exactly, what it is. Yeah,
exactly. And you're looking for an evolved understanding of the text that also evolves with you, right? For example, you have a saying by the Prophet where he was talking about how everyone can kind of, in order to build a mosque, how everyone can come and contribute a kind of a very small share of it. And he was encouraging people to say, look, you don't need to be able to afford the whole mosque. You can just kind of come with a very small share. If you think today about fractional ownership, that's effectively how everything has evolved. The stocks are owned fractionally. Now real estate is owned fractionally. Bitcoin is owned fractionally. So you look at this text and you say, okay, I'm going back to understand what was the mechanism that was used there and how I can apply this in the modern world to whatever financial instruments I'm using.
Yeah. Like, where to start? Like, if there was someone that was listening to this and just like, okay, this is quite interesting, you know, it piqued my interest, I'd like to learn more. Like, okay, the obvious answer is, you know, go read the Quran as a starting point. But then, you know, are there any other sources? Like, what would you suggest for someone to kind of drill down and get more of this information? Because you probably went through a similar journey. I don't know.
I would probably go ask ChatGPT to extract some of the relevant extracts and kind of go through this. That's an interesting
way to use ChatGPT, actually. Ask it all these questions and it'll just be like, yeah, actually, this is what it was.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I do. So the way I write these kind of parts, right, where I basically kind of extract a verse from the Quran or from the Hadith, and then I kind of link it with a modern story or a modern application, mostly kind of Western, just to show that, okay, it's not just us applying what's in our books, it's more of that people independently came to that view maybe hundreds of years later, but that's kind of how the system works. And the way I personally write these posts effectively by extracting the verse and then forming a view on what sort of story I think fits with that, and then basically go and ask it to come up with a story, right? So, for example, the latest one is a hadith that basically says when you have products coming to the market, you're not allowed to go and preempt and try to buy these products before they come to the market in order not to create a monopoly or control the prices. So then effectively I take that verse, I go to hadith, go to ChatGPT and say, look, what's an example? Give me a story that goes around this. Someone was coming and you weren't. And it gave me a story from Florence from like 300 years ago, where basically there was a shipment coming, I think it was from Venice. And basically what one trader in Florence did, he went out and he bought the entire shipment, massively inflated the price, brought it to Florence, caused massive inflation. People couldn't afford it. So the city council of Florence seized the shipment, banned him from the market for 1 year, and dictated a new law that says basically no one can leave Florence to go buy outside Florence. So you have to kind of wait for the shipment to come, be effectively kind of set out in the marketplace in Florence, and then you can only bid then, which is exactly what was in Hadith like 1,000 years earlier. Obviously, I wouldn't know what happened in Florence, but kind of ChatGPT does. So that's the beauty.
That's very interesting. Is there like a real-time example of this right now as well? As in, like, I don't know, because I think like a lot of people still do buy products, right, before they arrive anywhere.
Yeah, you still have a lot of like, again, which is what a monopoly is, or what a kind of a market abuse is, right? And again, if you go back, and that's why the Islamic system is so unique, because on one hand, you can think of some of its core values as 100% capitalistic, right? So there's no price controls whatsoever, totally free demand, totally free supply, full engagement. There's no concept of central economy. There's no concept of government planning, forced. So everything is left to kind of almost, you can almost think of it as as a kind of a classic Adam Smith invisible hand. But then you have these very interesting overlays, right? That says in order for these markets to then function fairly, you have to make sure that no one is manipulating it, right? So, and that's why you have, for example, one of the verses in the Quran about kind of Prophet David, right, where kind of a story around having 99 kind of animals, and then there was one left, and kind of not to take that last one in order not to have 100% of the market in one hand. You have a lot about the environmental protection, right? So you have expressly verse in the Quran talking about how every type of animal is effectively a population, just like our population, and we cannot harm it. How you have shared resources. So it talks about how if you have a shared resource, in that case, effectively in the Quran, it was an example of a drinking, so kind of an access to water. And it was regulating how you should have alternating access to the water in a way that doesn't deplete the water or harm the other person. So it has come up with all of these clear guardrails around it to have a very capitalistic system, but a system that cannot be abused for a kind of a specific group's benefit.
Yeah, that's really interesting, honestly. And like, why do you think that this is not a topic that's discussed a lot? Because it sounds, again, it's like really deep, and there's a lot of fundamentals there that kind of match with day-to-day life and business, and, you know, especially with where we live in the world, right, as well. So why do you think that people are not really getting too deep into this or talking about it or discussing it? Like, why do you think?
I think stigma is the biggest thing. I think today, if you are trying to say, I'm modern, I speak English, I am kind of educated outside, and you're trying to position yourself in a certain way, you then kind of worry about, okay, when I start posting texts which are extracted from religious, how are people gonna think about it? How am I gonna be perceived, etc. And how does that mean for my brand, for how I come across? And that's why I think it only works. And again, that's why it's just an example. It's not really, yes, while I'm a firm believer in Islamic finance, the point here is not really to try to say, okay, by the way, we've just found the next biggest thing, which is Islamic finance. The message is really saying, let's go back, whatever your religion, your culture, the place of the world, there has been thousands of years. There is a lot of value there. So it's more about how do we go back, unearth, evolve this, bring it to today, and be proud of our culture and heritages, whatever they are, and understand that they in no way conflict with the modern world that we live in.
Yeah. How have you found kind of like the interaction with you? Because, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but you started posting about this like recently.
Yes.
Like, I don't know, like 2 months?
Yeah.
2 months or so. How have you found the interaction and the engagement from people? And has it changed from what you were posting before to now? Or
Phenomenal. So first of all, I'm getting a lot of ideas. So for example, like if you think about like the posts themselves. So first of all, like the fact that there's stories, some of the texts themselves are coming from people. The idea of like hashtagging and making it a series, having it in different parts, etc. A lot of this actually came from people making suggestions. A lot of the edits. Second is, and by the way, we call it Islamic finance, but a lot of the messages I get and the engagement that is from non-Muslims, right? Because at the end of the day, again, it's not like, this is not, by the way, saying this is how to be a good Muslim, or
this
like come and convert.
Yeah, this is the way, and this is
exactly. So actually, a lot of people, and I had the message from someone saying, look, the Bible does have a ton of relevant stuff as well, which was for me was extremely interesting, right? And I'd love to kind of be able to see that. So the engagement's been great, and it also transcends the specific sector. So like there's one person that kind of, she said, okay, after kind of she saw this, she started kind of posting in Arabic about some of the items around a kind of child psychology and self-esteem, etc., and how Islam and how some of the things dealt with maybe children who have special conditions and things like that, and how it's all about inclusion and etc. So again, the idea is a lot of people are not even from finance. And by the way, also a lot of the ideas, they transcend finance. Like if you think, for example, about some of these behavioral things, when we talk about overconfidence, self-attribution, regret aversion, etc., these are not really only financial concepts, they're more psychological. One of the contributions I got was basically around a verse in the Quran that talks about the start of the creation with Prophet Adam. The first thing that happened was him learning all the specific names of everything. And today, if you look at a lot of the modern texts in economics with Keynes, but also in a lot of psychology, it talks about how the importance of specificity and how the way kids learn is by attributing a different name to every different object. And if you start to tell a very young kid that, by the way, this object has two names and this name can refer to two different objects, it totally distorts their ability to understand. And hence, being specific and terminology is not just a luxury, or is not just trying to be difficult. It's a way to be able to really understand and learn and relate things to the modern world. So we have the verse in the Quran that talks about how this. So for me, this is totally beyond finance. So again, it's kind of that wide engagement that's happening.
Sounds a lot more like it's, history. It's history. Yeah. I guess whenever you put the word religion on it, it's totally different.
Yeah.
But actually, religion is history.
Right, it's stories.
Yeah, it's what has happened and has been written down as history. It's like a history book as well. Like 100%. It's something that has happened, 100%, right?
100%. One of my exactly on that. Like one of my favorite phrases is history started when storytelling started. Because at the end of the day, you can say history, you can say religion, you can say books. At the end of the day, someone who told the story, and now effectively we can read, remember, and learn from that story. And these stories are kind of what's relevant at the end. Yeah.
I think that's the fundamental thing here that we're really talking about, the reality of that, history, like something has happened and you learn from that. Exactly. I mean, like right before we started, I just literally said to you as well, like, I want to avoid making the same mistakes that we just did. So I know what's happened in the past, hence I have to do this, right? But yeah, even language is quite an interesting thing as well. And, back to your point around, the purpose of all of this is for us to welcome our tradition and our, our language. And I think that is an interesting thing because I think the Arabic language, to a certain degree, I don't want to say it's dying or something like that, but it is, not used as common within the Arabic community as it used to. Some might say, for example, if I put this as in the UK, some of the Gaelic languages are completely dead, right? And I think it's quite important to preserve that and understand what that is. And that starts with learning what it is and going backwards.
No, like you absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I think apart from English and Chinese, this discussion we're just having applies to pretty much every single language in the world. If not already now, it will apply in short order, right? Because outside these two languages, they're just becoming so dominant from an economic perspective. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, today you have more than 99% of Chinese don't speak other than Chinese. And obviously it's by far the largest in terms of the growth, the people, etc.
Now those Chinese cars.
So the Chinese the language will stay relevant, because if you think about a timeline for Chinese people to start systematically speaking English in a way that Chinese becomes less relevant, I think this is a very futuristic thing. And actually one of the big reasons, back to the importance of language, one of the success reasons of China is because the industry, the technology is in Chinese. It means that all 1.5 billion people can contribute to this. Whereas the problem in our case, for example, in the Arab world, is when you effectively make a lot of the progress and the science in English, you're effectively excluding people who don't speak it from the progress, and hence by definition you're reducing the number of people. It's the same thing as you had with women before, right? Where women were not part of the workforce, by definition you had less progress and less prosperity because you were excluding half of the population from being able to contribute to your prosperity. So with language, the same thing. If you have it in one language that people don't understand or not everyone understands, you're excluding them and you're just shooting yourself in the foot, because you're losing the prosperity and the resources that they will create, right? So either you bring everyone with you on the journey, right? So effectively you say everyone speaks English, so you're going down more like the India model, right? Where, okay, I'm not the less focus on kind of preserving and trying to work in the local language, but then you've built such a strong education system that you brought everyone with you to the English. Now that still has some challenges like what we're discussing in terms of then how do you link with your history, how do you benefit, but at least you brought everyone on the journey. Or like China, you do it in your own language. But a hybrid model where you work in English and prosper in English, but you leave people behind not learning it, forget about culture preservation, is an economic disaster because you're not utilizing your resource. So there's two things at play. There is the economic prosperity, which you either do by bringing everyone along or by staying in your local language and having both. And you can do either way, but you have to pick one. And then there's the cultural question where kind of language preservation becomes still very critical.
That's so interesting, because right now I'm just thinking about, so basically what you're saying is language preservation includes the entire community, because the entire community speaks that language.
Exactly.
And by you kind of cutting that off, that means that the people that don't speak that language, then you're leaving them behind and they're not really getting included in it. And I can see examples of this everywhere, right? But yeah, like I said, I think that, for me in particular, growing up, we were always speaking in Arabic, but then whenever I went to study, etc., there wasn't many Arabs around me. So hence, I didn't really speak Arabic that much. And, language is meant to be practiced. And this is the thing. It's not that I forgot Arabic during that time. I just didn't use it as often, so I wasn't comfortable. And it took a lot to bring that back. And now I'm confident to say, actually, my language is probably one of the my biggest strengths. I don't think I would be where I am today if I didn't have the Arabic language. And I think we need to be proud of that and preserve it into the future generations as well to come. That's why I think topics like this is really key for people to start talking about. You know what I mean?
No, 100%. I think you're absolutely right. There is the more macro level conversation we were just having in terms of the importance of preserving. But then there's a very micro individual level conversation that if you are operating in this region, a big part of your professional success can be accelerated with being able to speak both languages, which not everyone can. So even if you park everything we've talked about from why that's important on a macro perspective and just think about an individual, if you today write, if you speak, if you can read in Arabic, that's already a big advantage for you operating in the Gulf, in this part of the world.
Yeah. So, what would you say is, something that people can do to kind of bring that together, to not make a separate agenda whenever it comes to religion or language and, with their day-to-day life? Like, what would you say is a way to kind of bring it all together?
Content. I would go back to the point you mentioned earlier. I think we live in a new world, right? We don't live in an old world anymore where if we want to do something, let's think about an organization and the union and bringing people together and creating an organization. It's a proliferation of content. If everyone today starts to put a little bit of content out there in their preferred language, in their preferred culture, in their preferred heritage, etc., and then have more and more people engage over it, over socials, over videos, etc. For me, that's the most powerful thing. And that's exactly how the world has evolved. And it's so good because, to your point, we no longer need to think, okay, I need to take an initiative now and go and set up something and see how I'm going to rally people. No, just go ahead and post, go ahead and create content and be out there. And then it's just this snowball effect.
Yeah, create like engagement around it. Yeah, and I guess we're doing our part in that. And, I wanted
a very big part.
Yeah, I wanted to definitely, talk about this and put it out there. Obviously, with this podcast, there's going to be a lot of snippets and a lot of content that we'll be putting out there, which hopefully, ultimately at the end of the day, I'm not a finance person. I didn't even really look into these topics too much.
You've done this so well for you not to be a finance person.
Yeah. Honestly, sometimes I wonder, although half our team are qualified accountants, so sometimes I just wonder, maybe I should have gone that way.
You've done great for yourself. So
yeah, alhamdulillah, all is good. But, doing our part in terms of like putting that content out there, but then at the same time, I guess, people are going to, engage with you hopefully more and with us a little bit more. And, they'll be looking at your content and, the stuff that you're putting out there. I think you were just telling me that you're about to record like a series. What was that?
Exactly. So the same kind of series like the Islamic Finance series, which we're now doing like in writing on LinkedIn, we'll record it into like short videos, like a minute and a half for each part. And then we'll kind of release it more wide. Because obviously, again, today text is great. But again, back to the new world, the percentage of people who engage with text is obviously much smaller than people who engage with kind of with audiovisuals and with videos. Yeah. So we'll be converting that series into videos as well, and hopefully kind of get more people to engage with it as well.
Yeah, that would be really cool. So, I think for everybody that is looking to get more information, they can follow you and follow your content and, keep up to date and probably learn a little bit more about the things that we're talking about here, because I think it's a big meaty subject, right? And it's hard to kind of put everything into like 30 minutes to say like this is exactly, but I think it's a good idea to do like a series around it and say, put snippets of information out there so that people can learn a little bit more. So are you posting this on LinkedIn? Is it going to be on LinkedIn then?
Exactly. And as you said, I think it's that bite size. I think, again, that's the world we live in. I think no one is not the right word, but probably a lot of people now don't want to read a book about it, right? They just it's bite-sized, takes a minute to read, it takes 30 seconds, it's engaging, and then people can contribute, people can comment, so we can edit the post based on like what people add, snippets from people. So if like you write something, it's fixed, it's more difficult to engage, right? But this is like evolving, posting every other day, so it's reflecting on what people said on the previous one, it's changing the style, it's adding what people say. Yeah. And it's kind of just that engagement.
Yeah, snowball effect. That's
exactly.
That's what it needs to be. So, no, look, that was quite interesting, like the whole topic together. I look forward to seeing these series snippets because I really want to learn about it. That's the thing. Like, I want to know all these things that you're talking about that is already there, you know. And I think, digesting data that way is really good. Digesting information that way is really good. And so thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this information. I hope all of our guests have enjoyed this. And guys, if you want to learn more about this topic and you want to learn more about, Islamic finance, the future of it, how it's going to, or how the fundamentals of it, or how is it being used in the business world, I'd suggest to, follow Youssef and the content that he's putting out there, because it'll be really good to look into that history. So thanks to all our listeners for listening today, and see you at the next episode.